You guys want to wait till like 4:01 and then get started? Because I think we have seven in our group and there's five right now.
Yeah, I think I say give them till 4:02 maybe because we only got five.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. How are you guys all doing?
Fantastic.
That's good.
What about yourself? You doing all right?
Yeah, I'm doing good. I'm just nervous about this discussion thing, but I'm sure it'll go well.
Oh, yeah, it'll be all right.
Yeah. Are we still waiting for people to
Yeah, I think there's supposed to be seven, so I think we're waiting. Gonna give them a couple minutes and then we'll get rolling.
All right, it's 4:02. I think it's cool if we get started. I think first thing the doc said was to introduce ourselves. I guess I can go first. My name's Abdullah. I'm a bioinformatics major with a concentration in computational sciences, and I am a senior that's supposed to be graduating this semester.
Congratulations.
Thank
congrats? That's exciting. I guess I can go
Um,
next. Oh,
sure.
sorry, no, or do you want to go?
There
It's
you
fine. You
go.
go. Yeah.
Okay, hi, my name is Aisha. I'm also graduating this May, which is exciting. I'm actually a third year student, but I'm graduating this May, so I'm graduating a year early, which is nice. I am a dual degree so I'm getting two bachelor's degrees. I'm getting a bachelor's in psychology, and I'm getting a bachelor's in political science, and I'm minoring in biology. And yeah, that's pretty much, yeah.
Congratulations again.
Thanks.
Okay. I reckon I can go. I'm Jack. I am a junior, so I don't graduate until next year. I'm a poli sci major. My concentration's IR. That's it.
I can go next. My name's Gabe. I'm a history major and I'm minoring in teacher preparation. I'm also graduating this semester, hopefully, but 2 more months to go, so it's exciting. And yeah, that's about it.
Cool. Cool.
I'm Connor. I'm a senior graduate. I have one more class to take in the summer, and then hopefully I'll be done.
Cool. I reckon we can do the icebreaker questions now.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Is
that
there one
sounds
in particular you guys wanted to do?
It says, I mean, anyone can just answer whichever one. So
Oh, yeah, I guess that's true. Yeah, no more.
does anyone want to go first on that or?
Yeah, I mean, I can go first. I was just gonna answer sorry, I'm pulling it back up and then coming back to the Zoom. Um, what was something you found most surprising or most interesting so far this semester? Feel free to be as specific as you want or to think about recurring themes more broadly. Um, I did not know how prevalent the fight for DC statehood was at all. Like, I mean, I think I might have maybe heard before this class some things about it. It seemed vaguely familiar, but I didn't know it's kind of like a hot topic. And I just found it really interesting to comb through all that stuff when I was working through the prep work portfolio for that week, and just to hear how much is going into it, and issues like specifically uh, the president is directly in charge of the DC National Guard. I was telling my friends about that when I found that out, and that's I think there was some speculation in one of the um, interviews that was going on in that module, that there's some speculation that that's why there was a delay in sending like basically help when the Capitol was being stormed. It's because obviously they DC National Guard was in direct was directly controlled by Donald Trump at the time. So I just found that really interesting. I did not know, all that stuff. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, piggybacking off of that, I also like had no clue about the fight for DC statehood until this class. What I found really interesting was they were talking about how because DC doesn't have its own representation, a lot of times the federal, like how a lot of laws are through the state government and other laws are through the federal government. They were talking about how in the podcast about how a lot of the DC laws, since they aren't their own state, it goes along with the federal laws. So whatever the federal government says is what DC has to do. And when I heard that, I was like, wow, that is pretty unfair that the residents of DC don't get to decide for themselves on their own state laws, that they just have to go along with whatever the federal government decides for them. So I had no clue about that. And I had no clue about the fight for DC statehood as well until this class.
I guess I can go. I also am gonna answer that second question, about like, or that was the first question, sorry, about like most interesting so far. I thought the topic on voting rights was probably the most intriguing to me, and just like how that has impacted like the population of the US. I think one thing I found interesting was the way that it's kind of up to the state on how they want to do voting across, and like how okay some states are with like absentee ballots and like mailing in. I think in one of my other classes, for bioinformatics, a big topic was about like Native Americans and like the representation that they get. This is less political science related, but like essentially, like back in the day, there was a study that went on the natives, and it ended up being published, and the Native Americans kind of freaked out about it because they were like, hey, like we didn't want this information to be told about our people. And it had to do with like their origin, and it's just not something that they had wanted out there. So I think kind of going back to how that relates to this, it was really interesting to see that, in terms of like access, like a lot of these like native on reservations, or they're very like distant from a lot of polling areas, and so it made it significantly harder to just be able to vote in the first place. And that doesn't go for just natives, but also just in different regions where you have like significantly less polling places. I believe, I don't remember what state it was, but they had reduced the pollings from 400 to 60 places, and there was like lines for like the entire day. There just wasn't sufficient infrastructure to support them, and their right to vote. So I found that to be the most interesting out of all. Yes, I think it was Arizona.
Yeah, another thing I remember about Native Americans that I thought was interesting was, like you said, not only was it that it was harder for them to get access to the polling place, I also remember something about mail-in ballots, and that, like, how mail-in ballots use your address, right? So the Native Americans who lived on tribal reservation land, their addresses were not in the form of a typical street name like the rest of our addresses. They were like, they write their addresses differently based on like the way that their ancestors used to write them in when they live in the tribal land. And so because their addresses were written differently, they can't do early registration through mail-in voting or anything like that, or they don't receive mail like to their address, which I thought was definitely a barrier as well, that if you're living in tribal land, you're already at a disadvantage because your address is like through a totally different system. So I found that interesting as well.
Yeah, I was gonna say that one of the things that I found really interesting that we talked about a lot was the whole like access to voting, that sort of thing. Like people don't have access to the polls, they don't have access to like polling places, mail-in ballots, what have you. All those things are in some places harder to get through, harder to access, which I would imagine, I mean, it's true. It makes it harder for, people to get representation, and that sort of thing. But like voter IDs, voter ID laws, poll taxes, like the history of voting rights and the access to the poll, I think was the most interesting thing that we had talked about for me.
What I found most interesting was from the last prep work, portfolio number 6, like Guam specifically. It's like a quarter of their island is a military base, and yet they can't vote or have representatives in Congress, or they can't vote in Congress. And like every other territory, we're just like using it for our military readiness, but it's like the people of that island just get nothing in return.
Another thing, this is kind of got to do with what Aisha, you were talking about with Native Americans and how they would write their addresses for mail-in ballots. When we learned about how, when we were learning about how voter fraud might not always be what it seems, and it goes through that list of like one of the categories was like abnormal address. So like it brought up an example of like this lady that lived like on the property of the company that she worked for, something like that. It just kind of made me think. Yeah, I didn't want to redirect or go back, but I wanted to say it made me think of like the unusual addresses that they um, sometimes get dinged as voter fraud when in reality it's just somebody has a somewhat unusual or out of the norm living situation, and how they try to get those people not to have the right to vote. It's just crazy. It made me think about that. So,
I think if we're ready to move on from icebreakers, I think a good question might be talking about the third required question, just because I feel like a lot of us have touched on like voter rights and whatnot. If you guys want to do that question first. All right. I can read out the question. If you had to choose a side, would you say that you are more concerned about passing laws that protect election integrity or more concerned about laws that prevent voter suppression? Uh,
I would say definitely. I thought about this question. I would say I would be more concerned with laws that have to do with voter suppression, because I feel like they both tie into each other in a way. Voter integrity, sometimes it was used in a way to suppress voters. We talked about how there were voter ID laws, registration problems that kind of made marginalized communities like have less access to the ballot sometimes. And I feel like we should be focusing first on, like, we just talked about those court cases and the voting rights act, and I feel like we should be focusing on making sure everyone has access to the ballot before we focus on problems with election integrity. That's my opinion.
I would say that I think the same way, because I mean, working through the prep work portfolios, especially the ones that had to deal with that, you kind of looked through them, like with abnormal addresses, for example, like you brought up. There's a lot of things in there that are like unlikely or abnormal cases of things that deal with election integrity, but they're not prevalent. They're not huge problems. They're not like there's not a whole lot that really goes into it. So I would say the more prevalent issue would be voter suppression, because that's kind of what has been dealt with for a long time. People are continuing to deal with it now. So I would say trying to fix that up is probably the more important of the two.
yeah,
And the other thing, oh, I'm sorry, no, you go.
I was just gonna say that like going off of I think it was prep work portfolio 4, that prep work had kind of broken down like different examples of like what like election fraud and whatnot was. And so for example, things like double voting or like like post-mortem voting, like those were all like things that like people will cite as like a huge like issue. But just kind of through the readings, we kind of saw that a lot of it was more so just like clerical errors or just like, people may have voted and then died after. And so I think issues like that are significantly less impactful than, um, I think like the voter suppressions because like across the country you have so many different ways of voting and like every state has like for the most part their own approach. Like yes, there's similarities. I mean there's some states like I think it was like north on the north side that like has a different way of doing like their electoral college where they break it up. I think it might be Rhode Island, not sure. But like that just goes to show like I think a sense of unity amongst the states in the way that voting would work would be more beneficial just because I think some states do a lot worse of a job at making sure that, they're being fair to all their citizens.
I would agree. I was gonna say what you said about the election integrity, how a lot of them were just clerical errors. We did see in one of the prep work portfolio assignments that it was a lot of the Supreme Court cases that it was brought to. They realized that they were just really small errors and they didn't make that much of an impact. Whereas I feel like voter suppression makes a much larger impact. I was gonna talk about gerrymandering. How I was thinking that gerrymandering, right? It's a election integrity problem because it's like, oh, we put this all these people in this district, we made a district out of this community of people and drew the line differently so that these people would all give their votes for this candidate and this candidate would get more votes. But at the end of the day, not only I feel like the election integrity and voter suppression kind of combine together because not only is gerrymandering an election integrity problem, it turns into a voter suppression problem because then you have like you might have marginalized communities of like ethnic minorities who potentially were put drawn lines in districts such a way that their vote isn't going to be as meaningful or their vote isn't going to have as much a say because they group them all into one category in a district line. So I feel like a lot of times election integrity problems lead to voter suppression problems because when you draw lines or you do things that are unfair to the election, you're also stopping certain groups of people from being able to have their vote count as much, if that makes sense.
I agree. I think voter suppression laws is the more prevalent issue because voter suppression laws are intended to combat voting fraud, but as we've seen throughout the semesters, like there's there's a small amount of cases of confirmed voter fraud, and it's just doing more harm than it is good. Like in Virginia, for example, the last 15 years, there's been like I think it was 35 or 36 cases of confirmed voter fraud. So it's definitely just harming more people and not giving people the right to vote than it is actually just combating voter fraud.
Weren't a lot of those cases in Virginia orchestrated by like one dude too? Like, wasn't a lot of it just like one dude went crazy with the voter fraud, and then it kind of skewed the numbers even more because I don't know he decided. I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure, right? Or
Yeah, they were
Yeah,
all relation together.
forget what his name was, but it was like she told us in that portfolio, she was like, ignore this guy because he's in there like 36 times.
yeah, he was going hard, man. He was going hard.
Ben Cooper.
Yeah. But I mean, that's kind of true. Like, it's usually not huge amounts of people doing it. It's not like large crowds of people storming to the polls to vote 13 times. Like Ben Cooper. It's not that. Like, outside of Ben Cooper, I think on that one, it's only like one other person, and it was like duplicate voting, and it was like an accident. So, like, it's really not that big a deal, but it's so much easier, I think, to pass like election integrity legislation because everybody wants to have like election integrity. It's like pretty easy to be like, I want my elections to be fantastic. I want them to be fair and equal, but they're not. through that legislation, but I feel like it's a lot easier to get that out there and get support for it.
Yeah, you're able to like throw in buzzwords in there, it's like, everybody's required to carry an ID, or not necessarily required, but it's like, you know, deeply encouraged to have your ID on you at all times so you can be identified. So like people fall into this voter ID, stuff, and it's just easy to, you know, create the fear too. Like you're just
Yeah.
using fear as a weapon and weaponizing it to where they have more control as to who and who can't vote. But yeah, I think it's crazy. I don't think I answered it, but I just agree, voter suppression laws that, don't suppress voters, I think definitely are more important because we learned that, um, like everyone said, I can't remember the exact number and I can't find it. I don't want to spend like 10 minutes trying to find it in the prep work portfolio from Unit 4. But it was like the state with the most voter fraud turned out to be like Wisconsin, I think. And even then, it was such a low percentage of elections that were tampered with. It was, it wasn't even really worth mentioning or bringing legislation for it, Um, so yeah, absolutely. I think that, laws that, you know, don't that lead to voters not being suppressed would be better.
One thing that I was kind of thinking about, and I'd love to hear like y'all's thoughts on it, is when it comes to like these voter suppression laws, like identification comes to mind. I know like there's something going on in, I believe, Indiana. Um, I think it was mentioned in the quiz thing that we had, and we had to do all the readings for like each question. But I think it was University in Indiana that heavily because there's just not a lot of areas to vote there. There's a polling place in the university, and so there were a lot of students that had campaigned to get their fellow peers to like go out and vote. And the way that that university had done it was just, you show your like school ID, and for the most part, like that was good. You could go vote. So I guess my question would be is like, what are y'all's thoughts on like if you have to show identification, like what does that look like?
Maybe like a driver's license? Could that be? Or like maybe like a birth certificate? I
Or
guess
rather,
is that what you're asking? Like what kind of
I guess
identity?
I guess I'd be asking like, do you think showing that ID is important? And like if it isn't, or if it is, like what would you have to show? You know? Like, do you think like a school ID is like valid to show for a polling place?
I'd say that it's pretty important to have some form of identification, but I think it could be much broader. Like, not everybody's gonna have a driver's license. Not everybody's gonna have like a permit. Nobody's gonna carry their birth certificate with them because that's weird. Like their social security card, nobody's gonna carry that with them. Also weird to do. But like you could definitely broaden that. Like school IDs, it's a photo ID. It works. It's issued by a university, an actual like reputable source, things like that. It's not like one of those things that you can make up. I mean, you could, but it's a lot of work to like make an ID just to like for especially a university ID just to go vote. Um, so I think the ID is important, but I think there should be like looser terms for it. It doesn't have to be like the three specific ones that everybody's supposed to have with them at all times.
I guess kind of to follow up on that is, do you think that ID has to show proof of citizenship or just who you are? Which is like, I guess kind of more important because you could argue that like a school ID doesn't prove that, you're from the US. So
Yeah, that's actually what I thought your question was getting at when you first asked it. Because I was like you said, a school ID doesn't show like what a birth certificate would show that like you're a U.S. citizen, or like what a green card or like what something else might show. I really think, I mean, this is my opinion. I mean, you guys might feel different. I feel like honestly, a school ID should be enough because I feel like if you're a student in the United States, you attend school here, you obviously what the government does, whether you're a citizen or not, what the government does in the US is going to affect you because you're living here. And so I feel like you should be able to vote for that government. You should be able to still have a say. Like, you know, if, like I guess I don't know. You know what I'm saying?
I think
I
you
think that
should.
also kind of brings up the like. Sorry, no, you ahead.
All right. I definitely think you should have either a driver's license or some sort of identification card. Like, there's so many things that we need that for. So, like, you can't drive without it. You can't buy alcohol without it. Can't buy a gun without it. And like voting, who's going to lead our country is very important. So, I definitely think you should have some sort of ID card.
But I think at the same time, like not everybody's gonna drive, not everybody's gonna buy alcohol, like not everybody's gonna need their ID for those specific things. So like it is important to have one. I mean, I have mine. I have to drive. You know, I can go buy alcohol if I want to. Like those things I think like are important on an individual level, but like broadly speaking, for those who wish to like vote in elections, vote for leaders and like legislation that actively impacts them while they're here, even if it's only for like I moved to Richmond 3 years ago. I registered to vote here because now like the local elections and things here, I've been living here for so long that they affect me now. Like, and I'm, you know, I've registered here, I vote here, and I vote for the legislation here. I don't feel like it would be much different if like an international student does something similar. Because I mean, the legislation and those sorts of things still affect you while you're here, like Aisha said. Um, and they like international students probably don't have a government issued ID that works here. Like they don't have their driver's license in the United States or anything like that. So like a student ID, I think would work well for that. I mean, there's probably like you might not be able to vote for the president of the United States, but like local elections, local government, like representation on the local or like state level, I think is a little bit different. That's just what I think though.
No, I would totally agree with that. Like my mom came here for higher studies, and she was an international student from India. And I feel like, you know, I mean, obviously she would not have been able to vote at that time. Now she's a citizen, but I'm thinking that, like, you know, I feel like maybe she should have been able to vote because when she was a student at Virginia Tech, the laws, at least the, like you said, maybe not in the presidential election, but the local laws, it would have affected her. My aunt and uncle, they're not citizens of the United States, but they're in the United States right now for their IT jobs. And like they're here on a work visa. And sometimes I feel like, I know that they're not allowed to vote, but sometimes I feel like if not in the national election, they should be able to vote for their local representatives because they buy groceries, they drive cars, they go to work here. Like I feel like, you know, they do a lot, like almost all of the same things that we do. So yeah, I would say, I guess it's a very opinionated question, but I guess, I mean, and everyone would have a different perspective, but I would say that at least for your local representatives, you should, if it's all affecting you too, then maybe you should be able to vote.
We want to move on to another question now.
Yeah, we can do that.
Anyone have a pick in particular?
Um, I feel like the question too about what kind of representation we've kind of already touched on, so I might as well. The question was, do you think descriptive or substantive representation is more important in a representative democracy?
I would probably say, at least for me, what I think is more important would be like substantive. Because I mean, there's a lot of people that have a lot of ideas that don't necessarily come from like similar backgrounds, similar experiences that I do. But I can still support them regardless of that. Like the legislation might not affect me particularly, but I can still actively wish and hope and vote for like legislation and representation that helps those around me. Because I mean, I, you know, I'm white. I don't really have a whole lot to lose in the current like hierarchy of how our societal demographic is made up, but like wanting to help other people, is completely different from that. Because like I can vote for Kamala Harris because she has things that in her like her demographic doesn't necessarily line up with mine, but like descriptive democracy wise, but like or descriptive representation wise, but like substantively, like her legislation, policies, and those sorts of things reflect my values more. So that's what I would want to vote for, if that makes any sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think it was a very beautiful way that you put that. I really liked what you just said. I was gonna agree. I think substantive is a lot more important than descriptive because I think, well, really when you think about it, descriptive is like voting for people who match your ethnicity or your religion or your background, right? And the only reason you would vote for, or not the only reason, but one of the largest reasons you would want to vote for somebody who looks like you or comes from a similar place as you is because you think that they're going to enact policies that are going to help you. But if they're not going to enact policies that are going to help you anyways, then why would you vote for them? You would rather vote for a candidate that doesn't look like you, but is going to enact policies that are going to help you. And so I would totally agree with that. I think substantive is a lot more important because at the end of the day, it's about who's going to help you and what you need rather than just who reflects your back. I mean, ideally, yes, someone who reflects your background is more likely to put policies to help you. But if they're not, and someone who doesn't reflect your background is actually going to help you more, then you might as well go for someone who doesn't reflect your background. Like you gave an opposite, like you gave an example that like you're white, but you would vote for Kamala Harris. But I'm thinking I'm Indian. I'm probably and I'm a woman. I'm probably more like Kamala Harris. But if it was like a minority woman versus a white man, but the white man was enacting policies to help minorities and women, and the minority woman was like Republican or doesn't exactly match my beliefs or is a different party from what I believe in, then I might vote for the person who doesn't look like me. Like, I guess, am I making sense? This makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm also gonna push for substantive, and I think another part of that is I think the descriptive representation isn't very encompassing. I think like I mean if you look at all the labels and all the categories, right? Like you have looking at prep work portfolio 3, but like if we're talking about like just race alone, like you have white, black, Hispanic, Latino, Asian, American Indian, Indigenous, and other. And like I think I'm not sure how like much you guys look into it, but like for example, like Arabs, like they are thrown in like the white category, but obviously, they have a very different culture, very different upbringing. And so like you could never have enough categories that would actually like fit everyone. Like for example, if we look at like I'm Pakistani, so if we look at like the Indian subcontinent, there's so many cultures there and so many different ideas and backgrounds that it's like all of that conflicts, like I may choose not to support someone from a different country in the South like Asian continent or like South Asian region, or like I like and someone else may choose not to support someone from like where I like my family is from. And so I think just yeah, going off of that is just like descriptive doesn't really mean much at the end of the day, because I think while it's certainly nice to see people in power kind of look like you, I think it kind of defeats the purpose of like, hey, like what have you actually gained here? Because yes, that person looks like you, but if they're not someone who kind of supports like your ideals and what you believe in, then there's kind of no point to it.
I think I agree with what everyone said so far. I mean, representation obviously matters, fully. I think it's very important that people of color are put into positions of power, um, because representation, like I just said, is important. But if they're not, pushing for policies that, because I mean, you can look a certain way, and you could look you could vote for somebody that looks exactly like you and they definitely do not have your best interests in mind. I mean, I'm sure it's happened before and it'll continue to happen. I mean, what matters is the body of work that is being put into place, the, policy changes and the fighting for, um, the fighting for, like, let's say, minority groups and stuff like that. So it's that's why I lean more, like you also, with substantive representation instead of why am I blanking? I already wrote it down. Instead of descriptive representation. There we go. So yeah.
I agree. I'm definitely more for substantive representation. I also agree that representation matters, but I feel like the whole reason people are voting is for their candidates' ideas and the changes they'll make. So I definitely agree with that.
I mean, you could even like kind of see it. Well, no, I guess not kind of like it's pretty apparent now. Like with Trump, the whole like I feel like a lot of the people that vote for like Donald Trump and that sort of like group, they definitely have a demographic, and I feel like they definitely vote, and in part maybe even voted this election in particular because it was a white man versus a black woman. They voted with the group that they identified with. They voted for the white man because they wanted like I feel like a lot and the majority of the population like of the constituents that voted for Donald Trump were probably white. That's just a guess. Um, but I would assume so. But like I feel like that you kind of put yourself in a box and then you kind of get like the whole tribal thing going on. And I think that kind of definitely like descriptive representation kind of plays a part in like the whole active polarization of the political structure that we've got going on right now, which I think is kind of a well, kind of it is kind of a problem.
Kind of to your point, Jack, like I was also gonna bring up the fact that like I think this election was very like stick to your people kind of way. I think I guess my question would be is like where do you think like the US is messing up for the fact that like I think we're all in agreement of like substantial here, but like why is it that like the majority of the population is still very much so focusing on descriptive rather than substantive? I think something that I would offer up personally is I think a lot of people are just kind of uninformed in the first place. And I think that plays a huge part in why people just kind of like they see their own people, so they're like, oh hey, like, he probably has my interest at heart, or she or whatever. They probably have my interest at heart, whereas like you see someone that doesn't look like you and you're like, oh, maybe, they disagree with what I think.
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
that.
I mean,
Oh, sorry. No, you go. You go. Sorry.
are you sure?
Yeah, you talk. You talk. Sorry.
Sure. I was gonna say that like what you just said kind of reminds me of kind of like the high school clique kind of thing. Like you see it all the time. You walk into the lunchroom, all the white kids are sitting together, all the black kids are sitting together, like all the nerds, like whatever group of interest you got, they're all together. They always stick together. And I think that kind of translates beyond, well, obviously the high school part into like the real world. I mean, like a lot of your friends, your family, your job, your work, whoever you relate with constantly tends to look like you, kind of hopefully share the similar ideals. Well, maybe not hopefully, but like share the similar ideals than you because those are the people that you want to be around. And then you kind of get put in this echo chamber kind of thing where you just kind of hear the same thing all the time. And I think that's kind of what happens, especially in like poor rural America. Because that's where I'm from. I'm from like way out there in like the middle of nowhere. Everybody kind of always has the same talking points. Not a whole lot of television. Like there's a few, but like those people get their news from a specific source, and it's probably not the most reputable. Like you said, it's like the information is terrible. People are ill-informed, misinformed. There's a lot of misinformation, and that sort of stuff plays a big part. But like in these smaller towns, you don't get a whole lot of like the breadth of information that you would in other places. You don't have a lot of people that have different ideologies than you. You don't get a whole lot of people that have different ideas than you in general. Like everybody's kind of working class, focusing on getting their next paycheck. They don't really have time to think about like the other things or like also Trump definitely like reflects and tries to mimic or like advocate for like working class people. Like he is in like he loves NASCAR. That's huge for like poor white people. He loves like combat sports, like that sort of stuff is like the it appeals to like the same people that he wants to get at, and that's like his constituent base, and those are the people that vote for him most frequently.
Yeah, I agree with like I think back to the I think what's your name, Abdullah? I think the question that you asked originally about like why is it that people get in these groups? I think it's a very us versus them mentality. Like have you ever heard of us versus them? Like and I the problem is I think that in America, maybe with the history of America or America's roots, that mentality still has not gone away. Like I would agree with this election, people did vote for who they thought looked like them. They didn't try to learn the other side's policies, or they didn't, like you said, maybe it's misinformation, not learning about things. I would say like I the two things I think are the biggest things for the us versus them thing is probably parental like how you grew up, your parental like guidance, or like how your parents taught you. I think a lot of times people's parents follow a certain political ideology, or they teach their kids a certain thing, and their kids grow up that way. Like a lot of I have met a lot of racist people, and their parents are very racist, and so that's why they became the way that they are. And I think you do learn a lot from your parents, and I would agree you definitely learn a lot from your peers. And I think a huge thing has to be the town that you grow up in and how diverse it is. I think part of like I grew up in a very like I know you also said you grew up in like a rural area of like America, or like something like that you said. Like I also grew up in a really like rural area. I grew up in like a almost all white town. I feel like that really influenced me being able to not just follow the footsteps of people who look like me. Like of course I did vote for Kamala Harris in this election, but that was because of my ideals matching with hers. And I didn't just immediately see her and say, "Oh, I'm going to vote for her because she looks like me." Because I think what it is if I was in a big city, which a lot of places are more diverse, you find a lot of other people who look like you, and then you stick to that clique. Whereas I was kind of one of a kind. Like I am the only Indian American in my entire town, so I've never met anyone else who looks like me or is like me. And so having it that brought me to all my life make lots of friends who didn't look like me. And so like most of my friends are white, and I love to listen to many of my friends voted for Donald Trump, and I love to listen to their perspectives as well. So I think we all need to get out of this like I'm right, I know that this is correct, I don't see the other side at all, even though like you could totally disagree with the other side. I think it's always good to listen to other people and their perspectives because they were raised differently. It's really not their fault if they think a different way. Their parents taught them something, their siblings taught them something, and they grew up with a very different idea of the world than you did. And so I think it's just really it helps you to listen to other people. And I think we should get out of this like this us versus them mentality.
So all my family, I was a military kid and I bounced all over. We ended up in Newport News, which is a predominantly black area, or at least it's like not as white as like places where all my extended family lives in Eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, Western North Carolina, predominantly white Appalachian, pretty isolated rural areas. So I, was fortunate enough to be exposed to a lot of different, people and cultures and stuff like that. And I think that, you know, just to say that exposure is extremely important. So like I was a military kid, I bounced around a lot, I met a lot of different people. My opinions and how I vote are, complete 180 of what my cousins in Kentucky vote. My worldview and my values are completely different than what they might believe in. And I think that's extremely important to go out there. Like even though I was raised in an area where there was a lot of, people, racial minorities around me, and I was comfortable and still am comfortable around people who are different skin color than me. I wasn't exposed to a lot of trans people before moving to Richmond when I, got into VCU. And so that wasn't something that I really was on my radar at all because I didn't really know any trans people. And so, and then you get exposed, VCU has a large, population of LGBTQ plus people, and you meet these people, you branch out, and then that changed my perspective again, where L- LGBTQ plus rights were not something that was important to me, but now one of my best friends is gay, so I'm, that's an important issue to me. It's a lot about exposure, and some of it, like you said, like isn't these, like my cousins in Kentucky, there's not people of color there, and there's not, I mean there are, but there's not a lot of people of color. There's not a lot of trans people, or at least people who are trans that feel comfortable coming out in Eastern Kentucky. So it is culture, but it's also, some of it is a choice, but some of it is also, like y'all said, like, you know, it's an island out there. There's not a lot of exposure, so it's just interesting. It's very complex.
I
It's
agree.
interesting to this day how different parts of the US like continue to be so different, like like you were talking about Kentucky versus Newport News. I found that interesting how like it really is the town you grow up in, and then how it's really interesting how we all start as babies, like whoever's born in Kentucky was just a baby, and whoever's born in Newport News is a baby. But then when you grow up, like the people in Newport News might come out, or Richmond might come out as trans or LGBTQ, or but the people in Kentucky won't. And it's like it's really interesting how different areas have such different political ideologies. I wonder if like 400 years from now these places are still going to remain to have the same ideologies that they do, or if things are going to shift around. It's really really interesting to think about.
To your point about like keeping the same ideology, I feel like that's more likely to switch than not. I mean, obviously, we don't know what the world is going to look like in 400 years, but I mean, like the current Democratic Party, and the Republican Party, they were kind of switched in the past of like, they had very like the exact opposite of what they think. So I think even going from region to region, I think like looking at like the way that their, I guess, economy functions and like the day-to-day life functions, I think as like the world changes around us and develops, I think you'll start to see like different areas being exposed to like newer ideas and newer things. So I think some places will always stay true to the core of like, how they started out as, but I think like we've definitely seen like shifts in like different communities just across like, just the US alone. So I think all of that is just subject to change, even decade by decade.
And I think it also has to do with like there's an age thing too. I mean, like a lot of the populations in these older towns, like it's like my town, for example, all of the kids grow up, they move away. The only people that are left there are like these old dudes who have voted the same way for 50 years, will continue to do so until they die. Like they're gonna vote red. That's what they do every time. But like the younger you get, and like the exposure thing makes a big difference because like if you move into a city you get all this exposure and then you come back, like there's a big influx, not maybe not big, but like there's a lot more representation now I've seen when I go back home of like blue collar or working class liberals there now because like they went back, they tried to go to college, they couldn't make it because they couldn't afford it, moved back home, started like labor jobs, construction, whatever, and they're advocating still for the people that they had met wherever they were, and they come back into the town now, and now they vote in the same way. So I do think, like what Gabe said, like with the exposure, it definitely plays a huge part, especially like going to places, seeing new people, experiencing new cultures. It definitely causes an ideological shift, I would say.
What you said kind of reminded me of like you were saying that how these people in your town that stay there, the old dudes, like they just keep voting red every time. It brings us back to the original question in the discussion we were having about like how people, why is it that people only vote for people who look like them? And I was and like and I was thinking like what I would be interested to see is the people who always vote red, if a candidate that runs in the Republican Party is like a minority and a female, and the candidate who runs in the Democratic Party is like a white male, and would all the white males who like kind of always vote red, would they not vote red that time because they don't want to vote for someone that doesn't look like them? Or like, I don't know, I find that interesting. Like, what do you think is more important to people? Is are they more loyal to their political party, or are they more loyal to their idea of substantive, like, like, do they want to vote for, like, rather than, is it more substantive or is it more descriptive? Is it like, do they want to still vote for people that are descriptive of them and they'll change political parties, or is the substance what matters more and it's the political party? Like, I don't know, we'd have to see that in an election to see, but yeah.
I mean, I know that like in my experience, at least local wise, like that, like we've had that happen like in our district when people tried to vote for, like, there was a white Democrat and then when there was like a black man who was a Republican voter, um, or a Republican representative, uh, in that district, and they after like they just didn't vote because they just didn't want to at that point.
They just
Uh,
didn't vote.
some people still did, because it's more to them, like they see the red, like the Republican you are in this party, more than like the skin color. Because they still, their ideas are still reflected. So I think there's still like substantive, but I think it's a lot more individual at that point. Because some people didn't vote just because it was a black man, but some people still did because they just wanted to vote Republican because they do it every time. I think it just depends.
I think that's an interesting, like scenario that you gave, and I think that personally speaking, with the experience I've had with family members, um, who do mainly vote red, and obviously it could be skewed because they're my family members, and I wouldn't say that you know, I- they're not the type of people that would not vote for their Republican candidate because of their skin color. But that doesn't necessarily mean, on a larger scale. I think that people that vote, if we're going to specifically talk voting Republican, uh, I would say the majority, and I mean, I could be wrong, but I doubt it, is because they're all fired up for Christian nationalism. I think that that's like a more prevalent characteristic of the Republican Party than um, the race of the candidate. And so, I mean, if you're a Christian and you're against big government, and or at least claim to be, then you're probably, I feel like, gonna get the vote. But I mean, I could be wrong. You never know. And I know there's gonna be outliers there of people who are like, I'm not voting for this guy, even though he stands for everything that I stand for because of his skin color. It just doesn't seem as likely. Um, it doesn't seem like that would likely be the case, though.
Yeah. I think the big like Christian nationalism thing definitely hits more home in like the poorer parts because like you still have like the old school Republicans in like cities who care about like the economics, the tax breaks, that sort of stuff. But like the newer wave of like the evangelical Christians, like they are hitting hard in like the South, like poor white communities. Like it's appealing much more to them, and I would be curious to see if that's just like kind of like a grifter, like you're kind of just saying these things to appeal to these people, while still maintaining like your ideas of like, you don't really care to like Donald Trump's like, swore on the Bible, made his own Bible line, but couldn't tell like an interviewer his favorite verse, like that sort of thing. It just seems it's very grifty. So like how much of like the actual like ideology of Christianity these people actually believe in? Um, I don't know. It's
I
interesting though.
I think not to question anyone's faith or anything, but I do think like as of recent, you've seen like religions be really weaponized, in a way of like using religion more as a tool of being like, hey, my belief is based off of this, because the religion says that. But I think like a lot of these folks kind of just piggyback on, hey, this is what the religion said, but like you could argue that like going into like reading these books or like just talking to like a religious leader, you could probably like find that maybe they don't necessarily like, or maybe they believe a certain way, but the execution of what that looks like is just significantly different from whatever it is that this political leader is like preaching. So I definitely do think that the whole like idea that you're talking about, Jack, of just religion being used, especially like in the South, as a way of just campaigning. It's been like a big one recently.
I mean, I don't really know much about many other religions besides Christianity because that's what I was born into. That's what I was raised with. But like one of the major tenets is love thy neighbor, you know? So that's kind of like the whole thing. Be nice to people and the niceness will come back to you. And that seems to be kind of lost, especially with like, you know, the evangelical Christian Republican Party wanting to like strip away as many rights from like people as possible. Like that's kind of what it seems like. That doesn't really seem to be like, you know, one of the core fundamental Christian tenets. But I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe it's written in there in the fine print. I don't know.
Um, Connor, do you have anything to add into this, or are we all good to move on?
I'm good to move on.
Cool. All right. Last question, and I know we kind of touched on this, but they say history repeats itself. Thinking about the evolution of voting rights, what lessons do you think we should learn from our country's history? If anyone wants to take it away.
I can start, I think. So I would like not thinking too far back, but like COVID-19 definitely changed the game in a lot of ways. Like a lot of people couldn't go out and vote, didn't want to get sick, like that sort of thing. That mindset during the pandemic, I think, definitely opened up a lot of eyes that we weren't as adaptable as we thought we were. Like the infrastructure that we have for voting, I mean, it's pretty fine, like it's okay, but like there was a lot of flaws with like mail-in voting, mail-in ballots, that sort of thing, polling places, like all of those things I think really started, at least maybe I'm biased because this is what I remember the most, because that was like those were the formative years when I could start actively voting in elections and things. Um, so maybe that's why I think it's like interesting, but I think like learning from that, like it kind of goes back to like the prep work portfolio about like the voting rights, the mail-in ballots, like that sort of thing, like making that more achievable and like accessible for like as many people as possible just kind of seems what you would want in a democracy. You want to hear as many voices as possible, so why would you make it harder to hear those voices? So like, you know, I think accessibility was one of the main things that I think we should kind of take away from that pandemic.
I mean, both sides, if we're talking specifically about elections, obviously the Republican and the Democratic side both emphasize how important voting is in the country, you know, and so if voting's that important, you know, like Abdullah, you said about Arizona, how they condensed the voting centers, you know, and got rid of a bunch of them, so everybody had a hard time voting. I think I remember saying like there was like raw sewage or something there too. I could be complete if that's completely wrong, then feel free to make.
They mentioned
I
that. Yeah.
remember that.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. But and then you know the lines like they people were there until like 1 o'clock in the morning or something crazy. Like if we're really if voting is that important, then why are we making it hard for certain people? You know why it? I mean it. In my opinion, it is strategic. I mean but you know there should be an investment and there shouldn't be in condensing of voting centers. So and I think that you know, history is repeating itself. I think this big push to combat voter fraud, it's like the what is it, the Know Nothing Party? How they didn't want immigrants to vote because they were afraid that they were going to sell their votes. Like even though I can't I don't know if there's any statistics behind it. I'm sure that that issue might have been a little bit, you know, dramatized. So that immigrants wouldn't vote. It's you know similar things are happening here where there's this big move for voter ID and stuff like that. Which you know specifically voter ID, I'm not going to go into whether or not I agree people should have a voter ID, but just overall legislation that could lead to voter suppression. You know it comes full circle. You know, Know Nothing Party, and now we're here, and our current president is big into combating voter fraud by passing legislation or trying to pass legislation that can lead to voter suppression. So I see circles.
Yeah, but I think like as but you like mentioned Guam and like how it like like there's like literally military bases there and like a lot of territories where, they just have absolutely like no representation at the end of the day. And obviously one of the biggest examples of like places that don't really have sufficient representation would be like DC. Um, I remember reading one of the passages where the guy was like interviewing people, and like someone straight up thought like he was from the Midwest and was like, I didn't even know people lived in DC. I thought people just commuted to DC, you know? And so I think like the argument for like DC, whether or not like you believe it's a state or not, like it doesn't really matter to me. I think just the representation and like or lack thereof is like a huge one where like I think originally like part of the excuse for why DC shouldn't be like a state was the fact that like hey like if a state doesn't agree, like we don't want to be within like a state territory, because then it's like if a state doesn't agree, like they're right there, they could like take us over or attack us and whatnot. But I think like that's a weaker argument to make, because it's like, well, sure, but also like we were kind of founded on the whole like idea that, or I mean, like part of what started the US was the fact that like, no taxation without representation. And it's like, well, you can argue that, but if you're gonna have all these territories in like DC and just like, be like, hey, it doesn't really matter what they think. It's just hypocritical to me. I think the other thing is DC is a very populationally dense area. If you compare DC to like even like certain like states like out in the West, like you'll find that they have very comparable numbers to each other. And so it's just like one of the readings talked about the way that they were impacted. I think someone here mentioned like COVID, I think it was Jack. But the funding that they got was significantly like less in proportion to what other states were getting. And it was like, well, I think the numbers game mattered significantly more there, of being like there's so many people, they should have the resources allocated to them, rather than just, the fact that, oh hey, they're not a state, so they just aren't able to qualify for this in the first place.
I think when we were talking about the does history repeat itself, when I was reading the PWP, I think what it reminded me of the most was when we were talking the very first PWP, we were talking about the freeholders and versus non-freeholders. And first of all, I never knew, like I always thought in the history of the country that only women and racial minorities were the ones that were not able to vote at certain points. I didn't know that even men who didn't own land weren't allowed to vote. I thought white men could always vote. I didn't know that, oh wow, you had to like own land and a certain amount of land. Like that really surprised me. I'd never learned that before. And so I think, but what that all that told me is, oh wow, like they used to prioritize rich elites. Like the having more money gave you more of a say in government. And it just kind of reminded me of, like a lot of things with this current administration. Like a lot of people are talking about, like, that Donald Trump has put a lot of people in charge who are very wealthy or very affluent, or like rich, like CEOs and millionaires and stuff. And I think that that just kind of reminded me of that, of like, wow, like so many years later we're still prioritizing people who are wealthy. The other thing that the freeholder thing reminded me of was we just did the last PWP we did. We talked about the FEC court case and how like super PACs are used as like as donations, like in campaigns, like PACs and super PACs. And of course, you can only donate that much if you're wealthy and you have money to donate. So I feel like, wow, like we used to prioritize like only rich men could vote at a certain time at America's founding, like only people who own land. And now we're still doing that, where we're having millionaires in charge of government, or we're having people donate large like super PACs. So I felt like that was kind of a history repeating itself thing for me.
I think history will continue to repeat itself based on who's in office, because if you have a Republican in office, they're probably gonna be very strict about like voter ID laws and that. And if you have a Democrat, it's gonna be like very easy to vote. So it all just depends on who's in office, and I think this trend will go on since the end of time.
Yeah, I think you definitely have a point because I mean, a lot of the time it is very cyclical. Like a lot of like even outside of like the voting stuff, like it's the legislation that a president puts forth, like it oftentimes just gets circled back to like Obamacare, kind of just gets they just go back to it. They do whatever they want to do with it, or they take credit for it, whatever it might be. Um, it's all very cyclical, and I think that, that is kind of just history repeating itself, and I don't know if that trend will go away. I think you have a point.
Sorry, I'm like kind of forming my thought, but I think part of what also comes into play here is just media representation, like as we've like discussed before. Depending on where you're from, like you have access to certain specific medias, like TV, like channels, news channels. I was reading about how Associated Press isn't like, I don't know if it's still ongoing, but like that they weren't allowed within like the White House, just like interviewing and following around because they refused to label Gulf of Mexico as Gulf of America. I think that also kind of plays a part to the cycle of like depending on who's even out there just like putting this information out, like you can remove bias from like media like for the most part, but like some places aren't even interested in that and are like fully fine with presenting information in the way that's like more beneficial to their party. And at the end of the day, like as humans, like we're all going to have our bias towards a certain thing. So with different medias, that definitely comes into play with wanting to push like the agenda that suits you more.
I mean, I think you see that a lot in like CNN, like Fox News. Those are kind of like the two polarized sections that like the average American will either watch Fox News or CNN. Kind of don't really get a whole lot of people doing both. Kind of, but a lot of the time, like trending more now is a lot of people get their information from like social media, like Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, X, whatever. But like that's where like because it's easily accessible, it's short form content, it doesn't require a huge attention span, and a lot of time you don't have to read. Um, but like these are not, the most reputable sources in the world. So I think, and even like with that, it's might not be necessarily like they're doing this for or out of like love or interest for their party. I mean, like they're doing it out of love and interest for the people that pay their bills. Like it's for the money that they are getting from that. And like they're getting paid to promote these specific ideas, whether or not they believe in them or not is speculative. But I mean, at some level, it's all about the money. I think at most levels, it's all about the money. We want to go into the additional questions.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. I had I don't know, I just muted myself. I think there was two that I wanted to maybe touch on, and I'll read them out loud just in case y'all felt like you wanted to answer them. We talked about this, or we touched on how surprised we were about the, Washington D.C. statehood, and we've touched on it multiple times. I thought this one was interesting. I wanted to hear what y'all had to say. Do you favor or oppose statehood for Washington D.C.? What about the U.S. territories? Be sure to explain your answers. Felt like, you know, we've already touched on it. We might as well answer it.
I would say I do favor statehood for DC because I think, well, multiple reasons. Number one, I think the someone earlier talked about the incident at the Capitol and how long it took people to get there because I think you were the one who said that how long it took people to get there because they don't have their own national guard, and it's like, I think if there's that, and you guys were talking about how many people live in other states is equal to the number of people, the population of DC itself. If there's that many people living in that area, they deserve like a say in their own government. And additionally, I one thing I found really interesting was a lot of the podcast was about the Black representation of DC. I actually didn't know that high of a percentage of DC was Black. Like I've been to DC before, but maybe I didn't notice. And I was like, wow, like it just seems like it. A lot of people were saying that it's like the Black community is getting cut, like a large amount of their representation is getting cut from being able to vote because of not having DC statehood. So that's like in order to get more racial minorities who historically couldn't vote to now be able to vote, I think that's a big reason to give DC statehood. And about the US territories, I think that went along with that as well, that a lot of the people in US territories are racial minorities as well. And I think, and then another point that was brought up was that, like, if you can join the military from either U.S. citizens, U.S. Territories or D.C., then why shouldn't you be able to vote? Like, if you can go enlist in the U.S. military and you're actually helping the U.S. out by serving in their military, why should you also not be able to vote? Like, I guess.
I agree that DC should be a state because everyone there does American things, pays taxes, can join the military, but they don't have representation. But I think the reason that they won't ever have statehood is because it's strictly a political problem. Because if it does become a state, it's guaranteeing two more Democrat senators, and there's it's going to be Democrats. So, and the way to make it a state would be to amend the Constitution, which is damn near impossible.
Yeah, to your point, I was gonna mention the same thing about like the constitutional changes that you'd have to do just to get DC into statehood because it is written like DC has been written out as like, being the place that kind of serves that role. I think for me it's less a question of like whether or not I oppose or approve because I think yeah, DC should be state. I think for me it's more like feasibility. I think one of the ideas, I believe his name was David Krukov or something like that. I have it in my notes somewhere. But he had kind of been like, constitutionally, it's just so impossible. And he was arguing for absorbing it into like the states that it was originally a part of, whether that was like Virginia or Maryland. I I think that is where it's like, yes, you got your goal of like, you got representation, but I think that almost, in my eyes, defeats the purpose because like DC in itself is like a very like DC has its own identity. I mean, like, I don't know if you guys are from, I mean, I don't, most of you guys don't sound like you're from Northern Virginia from just what you guys have talked about, but it's like what's like really common in Nova is like claiming you're part of the DMV and like like if you like go on social media and you see like DMV people will have their like parentheses around like the area that they're from whether it's like DC, Maryland or Virginia. um and a lot of like the DC friends that I have and like grew up with were just like people only put that up because they want to claim like DC as part of their own, which is I think I can kind of agree with that is it's like you're either from like Virginia, Maryland, or like DC, and it's like sometimes putting that up, you kind of want to throw DC in there. Um, and so I think like the route of being reabsorbed back into their states kind of takes away their identity as people that are from DC. Though I think that's obviously like their best bet considering the fact that like constitutional amendment is a much more challenging route and they've had their best opportunity like a few years ago and they're probably not going to see anything like that anytime soon.
Basically, like supporting DC statehood is like, like I would support it, but you guys bring up like the logistical, like the constitutional problems, amendments. Like that's a long road that has already been started, and they're only going to put up more roadblocks for it. So like obviously, while you can still like DC should be a state, I think, but like I think like a starting point instead, like even just extending the right to vote to those that live in DC, I think gives a lot of the people there what they want. Because like you might not be a state like nationally recognized, but you do have representation. You are not like taxed without representation. You are able to vote for your representation for whatever. I think that is probably the more important aspect. Like the statehood part, great. It would be great if it happened, but I think realistically, that probably wouldn't be super likely, especially considering what you guys have already brought up. But like, I think the main thing that people in DC want is that representation and is that like access to the right to vote.
Yeah, I mean, in a vacuum, I would say absolutely. I wish DC could be a state, not taking anything else into account. But like y'all say, I mean, there's so many factors. There's so many things that could go into it that we are not even aware of now that could cause issues in the future. It's such a big deal. I mean, that's a huge deal. Is creating statehood. Um, I would like to say like they shouldn't be taxed unless they are, we fought our independence because we were being taxed without representation. We fought as a country fought for our independence, or at least that was a large issue. Um, so yeah, like I mean, ideally, I would say DC should become a state. I think absolutely, but also there's caveats to it, and I'm aware of the fact that that would cause a large ripple effect if certain legislation was starting to be passed, and I'm sure that there would be there's room for negative for consequences that we're unaware of now, or that some people might be kind of I don't know, but yeah, I say in a vacuum, yes, DC should be a state, so should Puerto Rico and Guam, but also that's a lengthy process and could have a lot of issues.
What about the territories? Because that's like the second bit of that question.
I mean, so I mean, I kind of, I guess, and one of y'all could point out the differences. I mean, I kind of see DC as being in the same boat as like Puerto Rico, or I mean, but I guess you are a U.S. citizen in DC, right? So that's the big difference there is that you do have citizenship in DC, and you don't necessarily have U.S. citizenship in Puerto Rico or Guam, right? Like, or do you have U.S. citizenship? I actually don't really know.
I don't know that. I think certain areas it kind of depends, but I think one thing I think with U.S. territories, so I'm kind of blanking on my talking point. I forgot it. I'll get back to y'all on that.
Yeah, I think if you live in I think the difference between DC and Puerto Rico is if you live in DC, you don't get to vote for local representatives or state representatives, but you get to vote in the national election for like the president. But if you live in Puerto Rico, you're not even allowed to vote for the US president in the national election. I could be wrong, but that's what I think.
Oh, okay. That reminded me of my talking point. It was like in certain territories, not all, but like you have some sort of autonomy over like the local legislation. Whereas like in DC, like you're very much at the mercy of like within the US what goes on. No, and that's not applicable to all territories from what I remember, but I know like some of them, like they will let you do like you have a lot more freedom to do your own thing. So
I agree. Earlier, I talked about like that there's military bases on Guam and like islands. It's like that's never gonna change regardless of who's in office if they're not allowed to vote who's in office. So those islands are just they just have to deal with it basically, which is not okay.
I think if nobody else has anything to really add, one of the things it said, if you look at how I will be graded, we only needed 75 minutes. Does anybody feel a need or want to start a new question, or do we all feel comfortable here with stopping?
Wait, does
'Cause we-
it say you can do 75 minutes?
Yeah, if you look at Spring 25 Midterm Discussion Club, how it'll be graded, the blue point,
Oh, okay.
because I don't want to penalize groups with fewer people, 5 people, the limit was 75. So I figured,
Okay.
but we hit 80 pretty much. So if we want to stop right there, I think I'm cool with that.
I'm just scared of like, what if she takes off points and says we didn't go to 5:30? Or
Well,
she
I
won't.
mean, it literally says in there, because I don't want to penalize groups with fewer people, you can follow this breakdown. And then it's like 6 plus equals 9,
Okay.
5 people, 75, 4 people, 60, so on and so forth.
Okay.
Yeah, then I'm comfortable, stopping there. I mean, I think we've talked about everything that I don't know. I mean, I said I had some talking points, and I feel like the questions kind of lined up with my talking points, which was sweet, and I got to say what I wanted to say. So I feel like, I
Yeah.
think we're
I
good.
think we've also started to exhaust the conversation. It's been going a little slower, so figured I think we've all gotten what we wanted to say.
I actually enjoyed this discussion a lot more than I thought I would. Like I enjoyed like I liked how we all like interacted with each other really well, and it was really nice discussions. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fun. Well,
Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, but I like your Doflamingo poster.
I was
It's
gonna
very cool.
comment on that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah,
I like saw the
yeah.
leg and I was like, oh, that's him.
Yeah, you can tell by the calves, by the prickly
Yeah.
calves.
Wait, that's
No,
a flamingo?
Yeah, it's Doflamingo.
Oh, that's cute. I like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, it's my girlfriend's, and then she's got her squishmallows right there. So,
Oh, nice.
yep, of course, right? Of course, gotta have them.
actually, I mean,
Oh,
it's black
squishmallows?
and
Yeah, you gotta
silver.
have them. Yeah, I've got like I don't know if you can see. I've got like a ton of them on my bed.
There we go.
A lot of stuffed animals.
Heck yeah, man. That's sweet.
All right, well, have a good one, y'all. I'm
And
gonna
we could
head.
just like leave, and it's gonna stop recording.
Yeah, it just stops recording once we leave.
Sweet. All right. Well, I'll talk to y'all later. It's nice talking to you guys.
It was nice
Yeah.
talking to you guys too.
Likewise.
Bye.
Bye.
Later.
Deuces.